Hello and welcome to Reporting In. I'm your host, Malcolm Fleschner. For those of you who are seeing the show for the first time, this is TYT's show that's dedicated to the topic of investigative journalism, reporting, news gathering. We talk to reporters, journalists from around the globe, or some who even work for TYT about what they're working on, and we try to get the story behind the story, if at all possible. So today I'm excited to be talking to Jennifer Cohn, who recently, I guess, just did her first story for TYT Investigates. Jennifer, are you there?
I'm right here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it, and I'm excited to talk to you because you're a first on Reporting In, our first election integrity expert, which is I mean, that's the kind of thing that you have an expertise in, something that there isn't a whole lot of, as far as I can tell, around this country in terms of when it comes to election integrity. But first, I'll give a little bit of your bio, which is that you were an attorney working in the San Francisco Bay Area for almost 20 years, and then my understanding is that in 2016 you redirected your interests and dedicated yourself to doing work in election integrity, and now that's what you do full-time, researching and raising awareness about our insecure voting machines specifically. So what kind of law did you practice?
So I practiced primarily insurance coverage and appellate law, and the insurance was business liability policies, so it was defending the insurance companies really, and analyzing coverage for business disputes.
Okay, so then, and did you have, like, was election integrity a hobby or something you
No, I wasn't interested in it at all. And there was actually, it wasn't that I dropped my career for election integrity. I dropped my career as a housewife and mom because there was a gap in between where I decided I wanted to just spend more time with my kids who are young. And so for about 2.5 years, I hadn't been working as an attorney either. It was the 2016 election that really caught my attention on the issue of election integrity.
And what about it specifically? The general election or the whole shit show, if I may say so?
Well, the general election, I obviously noticed, like a lot of other people noticed, that the presidential didn't turn out the way that we expected, and it didn't turn out the way that the exit polls suggested. But that wasn't really what brought me to really research it in depth. I was on social media a lot right after the election, and somebody was looking for a volunteer who could do legal research on, I think, audit laws for the voting machines. And I had time, and I hadn't thought of anything else that I could do to possibly sort of contribute to the discussion. So I volunteered to do that, and it caught my interest pretty quickly, even though I was not initially all that interested.
That's actually something I found in my life, that it's really useful to know or to have someone in your life who's an attorney who also has a lot of time on their hands, because
yes.
My mother is a retired attorney, and anybody has any problem with an airline ticket or anything like that, she is just on it. And so that's, I mean, it's super, super useful skill, which, I mean, I'm not dismissing it, and absolutely critical. So for the past 2 years then almost, this has been an area of interest of yours, and yes. How did you come to be associated with TYT?
Well, they called me, I want to say about a week and a half ago, after the gubernatorial primary in Kansas. And Jonathan Larson, I think he just sent me a direct message on Twitter. So a lot of my articles and thoughts and sort of advocacy is on social media, and specifically Twitter. So he direct messaged me and asked if I would be interested in doing a story on Kansas. And I was interested, and I still am. I actually had to pause and think about it because there's so much to do in the election integrity area, and I had really been focusing more. I love doing the articles and the investigations, but I'd been trying to turn it more into motivating voters to make phone calls on certain issues. So anyway, I decided that to get the broader audience, that this would be a great opportunity, and I took it.
And were you familiar with the Young Turks? Had you ever heard of the Young Turks? Did you know what we were at all, or no?
You know, only because
it's okay. It's okay.
The Young Turks had reached out to me a while before that and asked if I might be interested in doing freelance. And so I looked up the Young Turks, and I was impressed, but I don't think I'd heard of them before that. I'm sorry. You know, as you probably know with kids, a lot of times you don't spend as much time. I don't know if you're on TV. You're online mostly, right? So right. I haven't taken the time.
Yeah, when you have little kids, it's like yeah, I know all the Wiggles, but I've never heard of the other internet sensations like the Young Turks. Okay, so Jonathan Larson calls you and says, "Hey, you want to go to Kansas, to Johnson County, Kansas?" And viewers who are paying attention, I mean, whether you're on the left or on the right, Johnson County was sort of last, at least on that election night, that primary night was ground zero for a lot of people were paying close attention, because we had, on the Republicans, you had the gubernatorial race between Kris Kobach, I think that's how his name is pronounced, and Jeff Colyer, I think, who was the interim governor, who had been, had stepped in or got that position after Sam Brownback, hightailed it out of town before the pitchforks and torches came for him.
He went to the Vatican or something, right? He's an ambassador to.
Yeah, it's some vague ambassador position. But so that was going to be a close one. And then on the Democratic congressional primary, Brent Welder was someone who had been supported by a lot of Young Turks fans, and he had a congressional race. And then that night, a lot of us who were paying close attention to the results as they came in, all of a sudden they stopped coming in for about 6 or 7 hours or something, and there's a lot of conjecture about what's going on, and a lot of the people in Johnson County are saying it's all right, don't worry, we're just gonna we had to unplug it and plug it back in, we'll be fine or whatever. And so the result for the Democratic primary was Brent Welder did not win, he lost, and on the Republican side, Kris Kobach eked out a victory by just a couple hundred votes, correct?
That's right.
So, and Kris Kobach is notorious. He's a voter fraud guy, and he's full of shit, like a lot of. But he's like even more full of shit than most of them. And so,
well,
what?
He's well known, and he was endorsed by Trump.
There you go. That's a different way of saying the same thing. And now he has won, but he's also the Secretary of State of Kansas. And who oversees? This is what my question. I don't know who oversees recounts and elections in the state of Kansas. Who's responsible for that?
The Secretary of State.
Well, what do you know? Okay,
he's the top election official. I imagine the governor maybe has some input as well, and the Attorney General. But yeah, the Secretary of State is the top election official.
Okay, so when Jonathan Larson says we want to send you to Kansas, what is he sending you to Kansas to do exactly?
He wanted me to. Well, I thought it was just to write an article, and here I am doing a show. But he wanted me to investigate whether there would still be a way to determine if the outcome of the election is legitimate, or at the time it will be legitimate. We have a result now. It's Kobach, I gather, won by about 300 votes. But the idea was, had so much damage been done already because of this election day and night glitch in Johnson County, which is the most populous county, had so much damage been done that we would never be able to know if the outcome was legitimate.
And what did you find? Like, I mean, so you went there, and what happened?
I didn't really need to go to tell him that we will never know that the outcome is legitimate, because that's the case, unfortunately, really everywhere in our country. More so in some places than others, but we really don't. A lot of states don't have. The main way to know if an electronic tally is legitimate, and I learned this from reading some articles and watching videos by a computer science professor named Alex Halderman, is to compare the paper trail. The ideal paper trail is a paper ballot. You have to have a legitimate paper trail to make this comparison, but you want to compare that against the electronic tally. That's really the only way to know. And about half, and maybe even a little bit more than half of our states don't require any sort of manual audit at all, and we still have states with paperless machines. And so the problem is even if you have the sort of the holy grail of election integrity, the first part of it, which is the paper ballots, if you don't have a requirement to conduct manual audits, you really don't have you might as well be paperless for the most part. It's true that if there's a recount, I suppose then you get to take advantage, even if there's not a manual audit law, but recounts typically apply, state-funded ones anywhere, government-funded, only if the candidates are within less than 1%, and in many cases it's less than 0.5%. I don't remember specifically for Kansas, but I want to say I think it's 0.5% there, and it doesn't appear anyone's seeking a recount anyway. So,
which seems curious to me already. Like, it seems like maybe somebody talked to Jeff Colyer and said, just let this one slide, and but that's conjecture on my part.
I've been thinking I'm conjecturing. Yes. So anyway, so without ever leaving Oakland, where in California, I knew already there would be no way really to reconstruct this election. But understandably, the idea was to try to get some details and to see what we could still possibly reconstruct. And so that's what I've been working on.
So I guess we hear about voting machines and problems with voting machines. This has been going back, since I remember back in 2004. Certainly, we all remember the manual recount in Florida in 2000. Well, we all who are old enough to remember.
Yes.
But so problems with voting machines are sort of ongoing, and you would think that in a democracy that has been around for a couple of hundred years, we would have figured this out by now, 250 years or so. But apparently we haven't. But when we talk about voting machines, are the dangers, from your perspective, are the dangers that there's something inherently wrong with the machines and they will miscount because they're just poorly designed machines? Or are you talking about malicious actors accessing, or even ahead of time or somewhere along the process to change the vote tallies?
It's both, but what it really comes down to is a lack of transparency. And just like any other, I've been trying to focus on the fraud mostly because I think it has actually been underplayed. So typically when you hear that there's been a glitch in the past, people have, and the media in particular, has taken the Secretary of State or whoever it is that was or the vendor's word for it, that it was unintentional. And so I've been trying to sort of emphasize that there actually is a real risk of fraud, because I think it's important, and I don't think you have to be a conspiracy theorist to recognize that anytime there's a lack of transparency, anytime something is done in the dark, there's the potential for fraud. And there's really, a voting machine is by definition, you can't see, the typical voter can't see, well, no voter can see the inside of it. The typical voter can't, even if they could, they wouldn't understand how it worked. And so it's a breeding ground really for fraud, unless you're going to have protocols that go with it, like really robust manual audits, and also something that's very important above and beyond that is a secure chain of custody.
Right. So
yeah, there's an inherent problem with any type of electronics and equipment, and it goes to transparency. And so in Germany, for example, they didn't phrase it that they were outlawing all electronic voting machines, and by that I mean touchscreen voting machines. But they had a ruling in 2009 that effectively came down to that, because what they said is that you have to have a transparent election, and if the average citizen is unable to observe the counting of the ballots and to understand, and the average person is unable to understand the counting of the ballots, then that's unconstitutional. And I hope that there's an argument that can be made to that effect in the United States, and that it will be made soon. And I think there is an argument. Our Constitution's not as clear as I would like, but anyway.
Well, it seems like you're talking about two different things. One is when the fix is in from the inside, the people who are committing fraud, who are involved in somewhere along the lines in the voting process, who are handling the machines or handling, whatever it is, transferring the information somewhere along that chain of command, as you put it, is not transparent. And during that stage, that dark stage, they go in and change the votes, and there's no way of telling that they did that, and no one would ever know. That could have happened in Kansas, we don't know. And then the other side is some external party hacking into the machines and changing the votes, unbeknownst potentially to the people who are running the campaign itself, most likely unbeknownst to them, because they're not dirty, they're not trying to commit fraud, but they don't know. So that's the Russian hacking we hear about, or just anybody, any external actor.
Yes.
And so so you talk about the chain of command, but before we get to that, if you're going to have electronic voting machines, there's this talk of paper ballots. If we have paper ballots that a voter gets a receipt that says they voted, and that can be recounted manually, I guess, or manually scanned, where it's clear on the ballot who the person voted for. I mean, like what are all the things that need to be in place for the kind of election integrity that you would want to see?
Well, the way that I would like to say it, the less machines, the better, because no matter what they are, even if it's just a scanner, which I'm not particularly opposed to the scanners, but those aren't transparent either. So the less machines, the better. when you mentioned a paper receipt, this is a really important point, and this is why I was especially interested in going to Kansas and Johnson County in particular. So the gold standard of election integrity is a hand-marked paper ballot. It's the best reflection of voter intent because you mark it yourself. It's truly software independent, so there's no hackable machine in between you and the paper and the permanent paper record of voter intent. What's happened, though, is that vendors, in particular, they prefer touchscreen machines for a variety of reasons, but probably the number one being that they cost more than twice as much as having a hand-marked paper ballot system, which would either be literally just hand counting, secure chain of custody, or optical scanners with robust manual audits after. So the vendors prefer these touchscreen machines. And so when all the experts started talking about paper ballots, and it really ramped up after maybe it was even before the 2016 election, but certainly it ramped up there. The vendors, they're clever and it's a marketing thing. So what they did is they came up with another touchscreen that would spit out a piece of paper that maybe their promotional materials don't call it a paper ballot, but certainly on the street, they and election officials call it a paper ballot, but it's not software independent the way that a hand-marked ballot is. So it's still coming from a hackable machine. And this is a difficult concept, and I get it, for people to understand why that's a problem, because the assumption is that if you can read it, what difference does it make if you hand-marked it or if it came from a hackable machine? If you can read it, what's the problem? And the problem is human usability studies have shown that people don't read them. The vast majority of people don't read them. And that, election officials actually have to give proper instructions for them to know to read them. Oftentimes there are long lines, especially sometimes that appears to happen in sort of strategic locations. So if you're in a long line, the chances of you going through that piece of paper aren't that good. The printouts typically to save paper, so it doesn't just go on and on and on. They're very abbreviated, which makes it also difficult to for a voter to go back through it and go, especially toward the bottom of the ballot, if you have like a 13-item race, to remember, that the last name was Johnson of the person that you voted for tax collector, or I don't know what the position might be, some judge or a particular voting district representative. And so studies have shown that those things just really don't work. And so the vendors responded to that with these new versions of what they're calling paper ballots that look a little better, but now there haven't been any studies on these new ones. And it doesn't look like without a cheat sheet, it would be any easier really for a person to realistically verify them. And certainly in Johnson County, where they have these things and they're calling them paper ballots, but they come from a touchscreen, there were in fact conflicting instructions, at least according to one account, given by poll workers, and voters were quite confused as to whether they should review their selections on the screen or whether they should review them on the printout or whether they, what to do.
It sounds like what you're suggesting is that the full flowering of our democracy should not be dependent on the profitability of the machines, the sales of the machines, and the private companies that are selling them. That shouldn't be the deciding factor in what kind of, especially. I mean, you think they're actually more expensive, so we would want the cheaper ones. The cheaper ones are actually better, but in this case, the argument is that the taxpayers should pay for more expensive ones because they're less reliable and they're more easily hacked. But they make more profits for these private companies who probably are also funding people like Kris Kobach. So
there's another element to it, which is the election officials also prefer less paper because it's less work for them. And so there isn't anybody really, we need the voters to motivate on this issue, and there's not a lot of voter outreach or voter education done, so the voters don't know that it's a serious problem, and so there's nobody really pushing for it.
Right, and that's the thing. What's shocking is that we have all of our elected officials or the people who are supposed to represent us who just don't seem to care much about this, and this is like foundational to the operation of a democracy, that the vote has integrity. I mean, do we really need people from the third world coming here to observe our elections? Because that seems like that's where we're going.
We kind of do. I mean, I think what happens is what I think happened with us is that once we started moving to touchscreen machines, nobody wants to who's been elected on them wants to cast a shadow on their own election victory, for one. And for number two, they don't want to scare the public that maybe our past elections have not been legitimate, which frankly is the truth. We don't know if some of these past elections were legitimate, or most of them really. There's really no way to be certain of it anyway. But to get elected officials to say that is a leap. And they're also, I mean, they may have a little bit of confirmation bias themselves, by which I mean, we've been raised, all of us, including politicians, have been raised to think we have this great democracy, and surely somebody must be guarding the henhouse when it comes to our election equipment. And the reason why this area really grabbed me is there doesn't really appear to be anybody guarding the henhouse when it comes to our election equipment. And I think it really has a lot to do with these conflicting motivations. Election officials wanting less work and the vendors wanting more money, and then the people who've been elected not wanting to terrify the public by telling everyone just how bad it is. And if you don't tell everyone how bad it is, no one cares enough to really deal with the mundane details and fix it.
Yeah, it seems like this is the kind of thing that is, at least in place like California, would have to be dealt with by like ballot initiatives. But of course, the votes in the ballot initiative would be tallied by electronic machines. So, and someone could hack them. I mean, one of the things that you mentioned earlier that I think is worth repeating is that even in places where you have an automatic manual recount, if the vote is close enough within 1% or 0.5%, that is really just incentive if you are a hacker to hack into a machine and make the vote 1.5%, and then there's no recount. So it's really the system is screwed up in so many different ways. And I think every time we see these, you see stories about there was a hacking convention and we brought an electron machine and it took this 6-year-old 12 seconds to hack into the machine, and yet nobody's saying, well, maybe we really need to do something about that. I mean, obviously some people are, but nobody in power, nobody who has some influence. And you're right, the incentives aren't there.
There is one person, which is Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon. He very much gets it. There are some other Democratic senators and a Republican senator, Langford is the Republican, who are trying, but their bills really fall short on some of these details on that software independent paper ballot versus a hand-marked paper ballot. They seem to not be able to quite understand that really, really important nuance. The thing I want to say also about a touchscreen producing your paper ballot is what happens on election day if there's what's called a denial of service attack, so that the touchscreen just doesn't work. What I'll tell you what happens, in some cases it has happened, is that some voters don't get to vote at all because they either don't have emergency backup ballots for people to hand mark, or they run out of them. And so there's that other additional added risk with any kind of touchscreen, whether it produces a so-called paper ballot or not. There's a risk of it being hacked and just not working at all. And yeah, you don't have to flip votes to hack an election with a touchscreen.
Right. Yeah. I appreciate you sharing with me all these depressing stories about how crappy our voting process is here in this country, and crappy in different ways depending on the district you're in. And I know there are a lot of people who say, well, it's all dispersed, so every district controls their own, so it's impossible. And that's not true. It's it really these people are clever.
Well, here's the thing I want to say to that. There's actually a really, really important point there. There are only 2 vendors account for between 80 and 90% of U.S. election equipment. The 2 vendors are ES&S and Dominion Voting. And so we really got, I don't know what the technical definition is of a monopoly, but something very close to a monopoly going on. So I think what happens is with DEFCON, people hear, okay, well, this little voting machine there got hacked and this one here could be hacked here, but we're all so disparate and I'm sure my state doesn't use that machine and I must be fine. And what I have been trying to do in general, and I'm trying to do it a little in Kansas, is there's really a story to be told about these vendors, the vendors themselves. And there's a lot of similarity from state to state, especially in some of the states that seem to go out of their way to not not pass transparency protocols like manual audits. And there is just a lot of similarity. Typically, it is the same vendors and it's very similar machines and it's really the same story. And so what I'm trying to do is kind of put a context and a narrative to some of the findings from the IT experts at DEFCON and elsewhere.
And in Johnson County, let me guess, couldn't have been one of those machines. There's no way, right?
Well, actually, they didn't get they wanted one for the DEFCON conference. I don't remember who I spoke with, but somebody asked me if I'd be able to if I thought I could get my hands on one. And certainly I cannot get my hands on an express vote. In fact, I wanted to see one in Johnson County, and they wouldn't let me when I got there. But they hacked other ES&S equipment, and I'm sure they did hack either at this conference or the last one or both. The machine that Johnson County had, this is Johnson County, Kansas, had up until a few months ago when they replaced it with these brand new ones. What Johnson County had before was the AccuVote TS, which is a really notorious touchscreen voting machine made by Global Election Systems. And it's paperless, so there's no paper trail, legitimate or otherwise, to compare against the electronic tally to see if it's been hacked. And so that was definitely at the DEFCON hacking conference. And what I'm talking about in terms of narrative, so Global Election Systems was also one of these major mega vendors. It changed its name to Diebold Election Systems. It's one of its machines was used to count something like 1/3 of the votes in 37 states in the 2004 election, and its senior programmer and a senior vice president was a convicted cyber felon, who may still be in the business of voting machines. The company technically dissolved Global Election Systems and was absorbed into the two remaining mega vendors, which are ES&S and Dominion Voting. But it was always a company related to ES&S. This Global Dominion was always related to ES&S because the founder of ES&S was the president of and COO, I believe was his other title, of Global Election Systems. And he was the one that brought in this, or it appears he was the one, it was right at the same time, that brought in the cyber felon.
Well, it seems like it's all on the up and up as far as I can tell. So I'm glad you clarified that. I also like that one of the
nervosity,
one of the machine called the AccuVote TS. I like that because they're like, the vote is accurate, and you say, well, what if we want to check? And they say, oh, that's the TS part. All right, well, we're out of time, but Jennifer Cohn, thank you so much for talking to us. You are much more informed about voting machines and the voting process in this country than I will ever be, but I appreciate your sharing your expertise with us, and hopefully your efforts at reform will not fall on deaf ears. Ron Wyden, if people want to look up the work that he's doing, we want to support the PAVE Act, P-A-V-E, but not the Secure Elections Act, which does not solve a lot of these problems, but the PAVE Act does. I know we didn't get a chance to talk about that, but I did want to at least mention that. And we've got your Twitter feed we put up on the screen, and we'll have it in the description below in case people want to follow your efforts. I assume you're going to keep going, continue with your dogged determination to bring reform to voting in this country and get our democracy back on track as best as possible. Is that correct?
I couldn't stop if I wanted to.
Okay, good.
I'm going to keep going.
Next time, maybe we'll fly you to look into the voting in Aruba or something better than Johnson County in Kansas. But I do appreciate the work you're doing, and so thank you for talking to me today. And for those of you at home, thank you for watching. I appreciate it. Every week we are here with a new investigative journalist or reporter we're talking to on Reporting In. So I hope you tune in next time. Thank you for watching. I'm Malcolm Fleschner, and I'll see you next time on Reporting In.